The morning sun spilled over the manicured crests of Sapphire Glen, not with a gentle warmth, but with a hard, inspecting glare. It was a light that seemed to measure and judge the impossible perfection below. The hybrid tea roses that grew without the vulgarity of thorns, the sprawling lawns chemically treated to a shade of emerald green found nowhere in nature, the silent, gliding electric cars that hummed past houses so large they dwarfed the very concept of a home. Into this hermetically sealed world of calculated opulence stepped Julian Beaumont, though for the next several weeks he would be known only as Jules. The name felt foreign and clumsy in his mouth, as did the uniform that hung from his frame. It was a standard-issue postal service outfit, deliberately chosen 2 sizes too large to bunch at the shoulders and sag at the waist, creating an immediate impression of ineptitude. A pair of thick, smudged, non-prescription glasses constantly slid down his nose, forcing him to push them up with a gesture that was becoming second nature, a tic for his new, lesser self. He clutched the worn leather mailbag, its strap digging into his shoulder, a physical reminder of the charade. This was more than an eccentric whim. It was a sacred pilgrimage. The Beaumont Foundation, the $10 billion philanthropic engine that was his late wife Eleanor's life's work, was preparing to bestow its annual $10 million community legacy grant. But Eleanor, a woman whose wisdom was as profound as her generosity, had instilled in him a deep skepticism of gilded surfaces. "Anyone can build a beautiful cage, Julian," he could still hear her saying, her voice a warm echo in the hollow chambers of his heart. "But a community? That's built from unseen things. Kindness, humility, the willingness to help someone who can offer you nothing in return. Dig before you build, my love. Always dig first." And so, Julian was digging, using the persona of a clumsy mailman as his shovel. His first day was a meticulously choreographed ballet of incompetence. He fumbled with a bundle of glossy magazines, their slick pages whispering as they nearly slipped from his grasp onto a pristine, dew-kissed lawn. He squinted at addresses, his lips moving as he slowly, painfully, sounded out the multi-syllabic street names. His first significant test subject emerged from a palatial modern mansion that looked less like a house and more like a private art museum made of glass and steel. A woman with an architectural blonde bob and a diamond bracelet that glittered with cold fire strode toward him. This was Blythe Montgomery, the formidable president of the Sapphire Glen Homeowners Association. She watched with undisguised impatience as Jules struggled to fit a small padded envelope into a mailbox that was a minimalist sculpture of brushed chrome. "Do you think you could be more careful?" she snapped. Her voice wasn't just sharp, it was coated in a layer of bored, dismissive ice. "That happens to be a first-edition poetry collection. I'm sure it's worth more than you make in a month." Jules looked up, his face a carefully crafted mask of flustered apology and mild panic. "Oh, golly, I'm so sorry, ma'am. It's my first day on this route, you see. Still getting the hang of these, very modern mailboxes." Blythe Montgomery let out a delicate, exasperated sigh, a puff of air that communicated his utter insignificance more effectively than a shout. "They seem to be scraping the bottom of the barrel for new hires," she muttered. Not to him, but to the perfectly silent air around them, a calculated insult designed to be overheard. She pivoted on a heel that cost more than his entire uniform and glided back toward her 10-foot-tall glass door, leaving him in her wake. Julian watched her go, his outward expression one of cowed humility. Inside, however, in the quiet mahogany-paneled boardroom of his mind, a new file was opened. He carefully slid the envelope the rest of the way in, adjusted his sliding glasses, and shuffled onward. A mental ledger had been started. Subject: Blythe Montgomery. Position: community leader. Initial assessment: arrogance, profound. Empathy: critically deficient. Character foundation: unstable. The digging had begun, and the first shovelful of earth was nothing but sterile, glittering sand. The days melted into a week, and then 2. The persona of Jules, the clumsy new mailman, became a fixture in Sapphire Glen. He was their shared joke, their cautionary tale, a walking, stumbling embodiment of the decline in public service they so often bemoaned over cocktails on their sprawling verandas. The mockery was a constant, low-grade hum, a background noise to his days of observation. There was the man in the roaring convertible who would rev his engine pointedly as Jules crossed the street, forcing him to scurry. There was the woman who yanked her prize-winning wolfhound away as if Jules carried a communicable disease. These were small daily cuts that collectively bled his hope for this community dry. He decided it was time for a more significant test, a catalyst to bring their latent contempt to the surface. One bright afternoon, as a group of residents congregated for an impromptu social gathering on Mrs. Montgomery's flawless front lawn, Jules staged his masterpiece of ineptitude. As he approached the gleaming, consolidated mailbox kiosk that served the cul-de-sac, he feigned a sudden, dramatic trip over an invisible ripple in the perfect pavement. It was a piece of physical comedy he'd loathed practicing, but had perfected. The mailbag flew from his grasp in a wide theatrical arc, and a blizzard of paper, letters, bills, glossy catalogs, and political flyers erupted across the manicured grass. The reaction from the garden party was immediate and precisely as venomous as he had predicted. A wave of unrestrained, condescending laughter rippled through the well-dressed guests. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a bray. "Would you get a load of this guy? It's a miracle any of us get our bank statements," guffawed a man in a salmon-pink polo shirt, holding his glass of rosé aloft as if toasting the buffoonery. "Blythe, darling, you simply must escalate this," a woman in a wide-brimmed hat trilled, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "He's a menace, a lawsuit waiting to happen." Blythe Montgomery stood at the center of her adoring circle, arms crossed, a smug, vindicated smile gracing her lips. She didn't deign to address Jules directly. That would have been a promotion. Instead, she spoke to her audience, her voice carrying across the lawn like a stage whisper. "Patience, everyone. Rest assured, the situation is being handled. Quality control is so very important for maintaining the high standards of our little paradise, isn't it?" Jules, on his hands and knees, began the slow, humiliating process of gathering the scattered mail. He could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on him, their collective disdain a palpable force, a physical weight pressing down on his back. He kept his head bowed, his face feigning a deep, burning shame, the flush on his cheeks an expert application of his actor's craft. But beneath the surface, his mind was a cold, analytical engine. He was a sociologist in a pristine, soulless laboratory. He noted every smirk, every whispered insult, every shared glance of superiority. He saw with chilling clarity how they bonded over their shared contempt for him, a man they perceived as their absolute inferior. Their community wasn't built on shared values or mutual support. It was a fortress built on a foundation of exclusion, held together by the cheap, ugly mortar of scorn for the outside world. As he finally retrieved the last letter, his hands trembling for effect, he glanced up just long enough to see them turning their backs, the entertainment having concluded. They returned to their drinks and their vapid gossip, the clumsy mailman already a forgotten anecdote. Not a single person had offered a hand. Not one had offered a simple word of sympathy. Their only offering was contempt. The file in his mental ledger grew thicker, the ink of his notes turning from a neutral black to a deep, damning red. The character of Sapphire Glen was not just flawed, it was fundamentally rotten. Yet even in a desert of cynicism, a single resilient flower of goodness can bloom. There were fleeting moments of grace that stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the prevailing arrogance, and these moments were almost always found in the untainted hearts of the young. One brutally hot afternoon, the sun beat down with a vengeance, the oppressive heat turning the interior of the mail truck into a convection oven. Jules's polyester uniform felt like a personal sauna, and beads of sweat traced paths through the dust on his face. He was taking a moment to catch his breath in the meager shade of a perfectly sculpted Japanese maple, dabbing his brow with a worn handkerchief, when a small, hesitant voice piped up from a nearby driveway. "Excuse me, Mr. Mailman, are you thirsty?" He looked down to see a young boy, no older than 7, with a shock of untamable brown hair and earnest blue eyes that seemed to look right through the Jules disguise and see the tired man beneath. It was Jack, the son of Allison, one of Blythe Montgomery's closest friends and a permanent fixture at her social functions. The boy was holding out a sweating plastic cup of water, clutched carefully in both hands. "My mom says it's super important to stay hydrated when the sun is a monster like today," he said solemnly, as if imparting a great and ancient wisdom. For the first time in weeks, a genuine, unpracticed smile broke through Julian's weary facade, crinkling the corners of his eyes behind the thick, distorting glasses. The Jules persona momentarily vanished, replaced by the gentle, grandfatherly warmth that came so naturally to him. "Why, thank you, Jack. That is incredibly kind and very wise of you," he said, his voice softer and gentler than the bumbling tone he usually affected. "I am very thirsty indeed." He took the cup and drank deeply. The cool water was a balm not just for his parched throat, but for his scorched and weary spirit. This single, simple act of unprompted kindness was a tiny, verdant oasis in the vast desert of contempt he had been navigating. It was a data point that contradicted all the others, a flicker of hope he hadn't realized he'd been so desperate to find. He thought of Eleanor and how she would have adored this boy's simple, profound decency. Just as he was about to hand the cup back with a heartfelt thank you, the front door of the house swung open and Allison appeared on the porch, a phone pressed to her ear. "Jack, what are you doing? I've told you a dozen times not to bother the help," she called out, her voice laced with the same casual, ingrained disdain as her friend's. Her words were a splash of ice water, extinguishing the small, precious warmth of the moment. Jack's face fell, his shoulders slumping in disappointment. "But Mom, he was thirsty. He looked really, really hot." "Now, Jack," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument or compassion. "Come inside right now. Mrs. Montgomery is on the phone." The boy gave Jules a final, deeply apologetic look, a silent apology for his mother's behavior, before scurrying back toward the house. Julian watched him go, the brief warmth of the encounter fading into a familiar, disheartening chill. The incident was profoundly, painfully telling. Kindness and empathy weren't absent here. They existed in their purest form, but they were being actively discouraged, treated like a weed to be pulled, pruned back lest they spoil the perfect, sterile aesthetic of their lives. The adults were diligently, methodically teaching their children to adopt their own prejudices, to see service as servitude, and to place human beings into neat, cruel categories of worth. He finished the water and set the empty cup down carefully on the edge of the lawn, a small plastic monument to a fleeting connection that now felt like a eulogy. The test wasn't just about the present character of Sapphire Glen, it was about the future they were building. And it was a future that looked increasingly, tragically undeserving of Eleanor's enduring legacy. The final, irrevocable act, the one that broke the back of Julian's carefully maintained patience and turned his scientific observation into a matter of personal honor, came on a crisp autumn morning. It wasn't a grand theatrical display of cruelty like the mail spill incident, but a quiet surgical strike of humiliation that solidified his decision with a chilling, absolute certainty. He was delivering a certified letter to the Montgomery residence. The document, he knew from the sender, a high-end landscaping firm, concerned a petty dispute over the trimming of an ornamental shrub. The triviality of it all made what followed even more grotesque. He rang the bell, and after a moment, Blythe Montgomery answered, a luxurious cashmere robe wrapped tightly around her, her expression already soured by the unwelcome interruption to her morning routine. She looked at the standard-issue clipboard and pen he held out with a look of theatrical revulsion, as if he were presenting her with a dead rat. "I am certainly not touching that pen," she said, her nose wrinkling in disgust as she took a half-step back. "Good heavens, who knows what germs it's carrying? You will hold the clipboard perfectly steady, and I will sign with my own instrument." She disappeared for a moment and returned with a slender, gold-plated fountain pen that probably cost more than his monthly car payment used to. Julian, maintaining his flustered Jules demeanor, complied without a word, holding the clipboard with both hands as she scribbled an illegible, angry signature across the line. As he was about to turn away, deeply relieved the interaction was over, she held up a perfectly manicured hand, a silent command to halt that was as imperious as a queen's decree. "One moment, don't you move." She pulled out her sleek, top-of-the-line smartphone, her crimson-tipped fingers flying across the screen with practiced, venomous speed. Julian stood there, a captive audience on her marble doorstep, feeling a cold, heavy dread creep into his stomach. He could hear her voice, now dripping with a manufactured saccharine concern that was more insulting than any shout, as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, hello? I wish to speak to a supervisor at the main post office, immediately," she began, her eyes flicking to Jules's name tag with predatory glee. "I am calling yet again about the new carrier on the Sapphire Glen route. His name is Jules, I believe?" She glanced at him, a flicker of cold, reptilian triumph in her eyes. "He is simply not fit for this position. He is agonizingly slow, he is dangerously clumsy, and frankly his entire unkempt presence dramatically lowers the tone of this entire neighborhood. Today he almost smudged the signature form for a very important legal document." Julian stood frozen, the clipboard still clutched in his hands. He was forced to listen to a detailed, malicious, and almost entirely fabricated account of his every feigned mistake. She painted him as a bumbling imbecile, a liability, a disgrace to the federal government. She wasn't just complaining. She was actively, cruelly attempting to destroy a man's livelihood over her own suffocating snobbery, for the simple sin of not meeting her absurd standards of aesthetic perfection. "If he isn't removed from this route immediately," she concluded, her voice turning to a blade of steel, "I will be having my husband's legal team get involved." The prestigious Beaumont Foundation is considering a massive, multi-million-dollar grant for this community, a grant I have worked tirelessly to secure, and we simply cannot have this sort of incompetence representing us to the outside world. Do you understand the liability you are creating for everyone? She hung up without waiting for a reply, and gave Jules a final, dismissive glare that felt like a physical blow. "I trust that will be handled," she said, before closing the heavy, soundproofed door in his face, with a decisive, echoing click. Julian lowered the clipboard, his arm feeling as heavy as lead. His face was a blank canvas, but his mind was a whirlwind of absolute, icy clarity. She had used the foundation, his foundation, Eleanor's legacy, as a weapon. She had invoked his wife's sacred name as a tool of her own petty, pathetic tyranny. The test was over. The results were in. Sapphire Glen had failed in a way so spectacular, so profoundly offensive, that it demanded an equally spectacular response. A week later, the day of the Beaumont Foundation's community grant announcement dawned bright, clear, and brimming with a misplaced, almost religious optimism. An air of festive, self-congratulatory anticipation buzzed through Sapphire Glen like a high-voltage current. The chosen venue was the sprawling back lawn of the community clubhouse, a perfectly manicured expanse of green that rolled down to a championship golf course. Large, elegant white tents had been erected, their peaks fluttering gently in the breeze. Caterers in crisp black and white uniforms bustled about with gleaming silver trays of veuve clicquot and an endless supply of miniature quiches, lobster puffs, and other bite-sized emblems of wealth. A small string quartet, positioned discreetly near a fragrant rose garden, played a cheerful selection of Vivaldi and Mozart, providing a soundtrack of refined, effortless elegance. The residents were dressed in their weekend finest, men in soft cashmere sweaters and tailored linen trousers, women in flowing designer sundresses and tasteful, sun-catching diamonds. At the very center of this tableau of triumphant affluence, holding court like a queen in her garden, was Blythe Montgomery. She had, over the past week, taken full and complete credit for securing the attention of the prestigious foundation, weaving a detailed and compelling narrative of her own tireless efforts. "It was a long and rather arduous process, of course," she explained to a rapt audience, gesturing gracefully with her flute of champagne. "I had to write numerous letters and make several very persuasive calls to assure them that Sapphire Glen represents the very pinnacle of American community values. I highlighted our commitment to excellence, our aesthetic harmony, and our unwavering dedication to maintaining the highest possible standards in all things. They were, as you can imagine, incredibly impressed." Murmurs of agreement and fawning, sycophantic praise washed over her. "We have you to thank for all of this, Blythe, darling," said a man whose luxury real estate business stood to benefit immensely from the grant and the associated prestige. "Your leadership and vision are truly what make this place so special." Mrs. Montgomery beamed, absorbing the accolades not as compliments, but as her divine right. The $10 million grant was seen not as a possibility, but as a foregone conclusion, a reward for their inherent collective superiority. They were already debating, with great enthusiasm and a complete lack of irony, how to spend their winnings. A new state-of-the-art, 24-hour security system with thermal imaging and drone patrols. An expansion of the clubhouse to include a full-service spa and a Michelin-starred chef in residence. Perhaps even a heated, Olympic-sized saltwater swimming pool with underwater speakers. Their conversation was a symphony of entitlement and greed, a chorus of people congratulating themselves for a prize they had not yet won. No one gave a second thought to the bumbling mailman, Jules, who had been conspicuously absent for the past few days. They simply assumed, with a smug, quiet satisfaction, that Blythe Montgomery's complaint had been successful, and he had been unceremoniously fired and relegated back to whatever bleak, unremarkable world he had emerged from. As the ornate clock on the clubhouse tower chimed the hour of 10 a.m., the designated time for the announcement, a hush fell over the chattering crowd. All eyes turned toward the winding, tree-lined asphalt road that led to the clubhouse, expecting the imminent arrival of a sleek black European limousine. They pictured a distinguished-looking executive from the Beaumont Foundation, the bearer of good news and a very large ceremonial check. Blythe smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and took a proprietary position near the small, flower-adorned podium, ready to officially welcome their benefactors and accept their generous gift on behalf of the community she had so carefully and so ruthlessly curated. The air was thick with expectation, a perfect, glittering bubble of hubris waiting for the inevitable, devastating pinprick. The first indication that the day would not unfold according to their gilded script was the sound. It wasn't the refined, discreet purr of a single approaching limousine, but a low, powerful, and deeply intimidating rumble of multiple large engines working in perfect, menacing concert. Then they appeared. Cresting the gentle, sun-drenched hill was not one car, but a formidable, almost military-style convoy of 5 identical, imposing black Cadillac Escalades. Their tinted windows were so dark they drank the morning light, reflecting nothing, making them look less like vehicles and more like a procession of obsidian predators gliding through the idyllic, sun-dappled landscape. They moved with a silent, coordinated precision that spoke of Secret Service details and immense, untouchable power, a sight more suited to a presidential visit or a G7 summit than a suburban community grant announcement. The convoy didn't proceed to the clubhouse's circular driveway, as everyone, with mounting confusion, expected. Instead, with an unnerving and deliberate purpose, it continued down the road and came to a synchronized, silent halt directly in front of a familiar, humble, and now utterly incongruous vehicle parked at the curb. A standard-issue, white and blue United States Postal Service truck, an object they had all learned to view with contempt. The residents of Sapphire Glen exchanged confused, uneasy glances. The string quartet faltered mid-bar, a single violin letting out a discordant, questioning squeak before the music died completely. A wave of anxious, sibilant murmuring swept through the crowd. What on earth is going on? Who is that? Why in God's name are they stopping for the mail truck? Is there a problem? Blythe Montgomery's perfectly composed smile tightened at the edges, the first visible crack in her facade of serene, absolute control. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated event. This was an intrusion, a vulgar display of force that disrupted the day's elegant, pre-written narrative. The doors of the lead Escalade opened with a soft, authoritative click. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark, tailored suit and a silver tie stepped out. He was lean and sharp, with the calm, intelligent, and no-nonsense look of a man who managed empires. This was Elias Keller, the executive director of the Beaumont Foundation. He calmly surveyed the bizarre scene, his cool gaze sweeping over the gawking, pastel-clad crowd before settling on the humble mail truck. He walked, not toward the podium or the waiting, now visibly unnerved Mrs. Montgomery, but directly to the driver's side door of the postal vehicle. The crowd held its collective breath. 100 mimosas paused halfway to 100 mouths, the silence so total one could hear the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. The door of the mail truck swung open, and out stepped a figure they all recognized, yet suddenly didn't know at all. It was Jules. But he wasn't shuffling. He wasn't fumbling. He stood tall and straight, his posture radiating a quiet, solid confidence that was utterly alien to them. Elias Keller, a man who commanded respect with his very presence, inclined his head slightly. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the complex language of power. It was a gesture of profound, unwavering deference. The crowd watched, paralyzed by a dawning, terrifying confusion as the powerful man in the expensive suit addressed the clumsy, pathetic mailman they had all scorned with such unthinking relish. Elias Keller's voice was calm, clear, and carried across the stunned, unnatural silence of the lawn with the perfect, dispassionate enunciation of a courtroom lawyer. "Mr. Beaumont, sir," he said, his tone a seamless and practiced blend of professional respect and deep, personal loyalty. "All the documents have been prepared as you requested. We are ready to proceed when you are." The name, Beaumont, hung in the air for a long, pregnant moment, an impossible, discordant note that shattered their entire reality. It echoed in the quiet ricocheting off the stunned, slack-jawed faces of the assembly. Beaumont, the name of the foundation, the name of the fortune, the name of the money they had been so certain was theirs. Blythe Montgomery's face, which had been a mask of confident pride just moments before, seemed to physically crumble. The vibrant, healthy color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty grayish pallor of pure shock. Her champagne flute trembled so violently in her hand that its contents sloshed over the rim. Julian Beaumont, no longer Jules, reached up and slowly, deliberately removed the thick, unflattering glasses. Without them, his eyes were revealed to be sharp, intelligent, and piercingly blue, carrying the formidable weight of years of shrewd observation and decisive leadership. He unbuttoned the top button of the ill-fitting postal uniform and straightened his shoulders, the cheap, starchy fabric settling differently on his powerful frame. The transformation was breathtaking and absolute. The clumsy, pitiable mailman was gone, stripped away like a cheap costume. In his place stood a man radiating an aura of quiet, unassailable authority, a man utterly comfortable with the immense power he wielded. He gave Elias a slight, appreciative nod, then turned to face the dumbstruck residents of Sapphire Glen. He walked past Elias, past the silent, hulking escalades, and stepped onto the manicured lawn. The crowd instinctively parted before him, as if he were a force of nature, creating a clear, wide path to the now abandoned podium. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every eye was locked on him, every ear straining to hear the judgment he was about to deliver. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and resonant, carrying the natural command of a man used to addressing boardrooms and international symposiums. "My name is Julian Beaumont. My late wife Eleanor, for whom the Beaumont Foundation is named, believed that true wealth is not measured in property values or stock portfolios, but in the richness and depth of human character. She believed that kindness, humility, and compassion were the cornerstones of any true community." He paused, letting his gaze drift slowly from one horrified face to another, a silent, personal indictment of each and every person present. His eyes finally came to rest on the ghost-white, terror-stricken face of Blythe Montgomery. "I came to your community in disguise because I needed to see those values for myself. I wanted to see if this was a place truly worthy of her sacred legacy. For several weeks, I have walked your streets, I have delivered your mail, and I have observed." A deathly quiet had fallen, so profound that the distant, cheerful chirping of birds sounded like a cruel mockery. "And what you have shown me," Julian continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, turning from observation to accusation, "is a community built not on character but on arrogance. You've shown me contempt for those you deem beneath you and a smug, ugly satisfaction in your own superiority. I saw you laugh when a man dropped his letters. I heard you joke about his intelligence. I saw you pull your children away from him as if he were unclean. You bonded not through fellowship, but through the shared, cruel mockery of a man you thought was powerless. He looked directly at Blythe now, his gaze like a physical blow that made her flinch. And you, Mrs. Montgomery, you, who would be the steward of this grant, you used the name of my foundation, my wife's name, as a weapon, as a threat to have that man fired from his job. You failed the test. You have all unequivocally failed the test. The finality in Julian Beaumont's voice was absolute, as cold and hard as the marble steps of the clubhouse. There was no room for appeal, no space for the desperate, stammering excuses that were already forming on the silent lips of the residents. The judgment had been delivered from the highest possible court, and the sentence was about to be passed with swift, unwavering justice. Therefore, he announced, his voice ringing with the clarity of a bell across the pristine lawn, his words a death knell to their greedy dreams. The Beaumont Foundation's $10 million community legacy grant to Sapphire Glen is officially and permanently canceled, effective immediately. A collective, audible gasp swept through the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. We will be redirecting the entirety of the funds, he continued, leaving no doubt as to the consequences of their actions, to organizations that truly embody the spirit of community that my Eleanor so cherished. $5 million will go to the downtown St. Jude's shelter to feed and house the homeless you so clearly despise. The other $5 million will establish a vocational training program for inner-city youth to give them the opportunities you all take for granted. We will fund programs that teach the fundamental values of empathy and respect, lessons this community has clearly forgotten or perhaps never cared to learn in the first place. He didn't wait for a reaction. His part was done. The audit was complete. The books were closed. Without another glance at the sea of pale, shocked, and now furious faces, he turned with a quiet, heavy dignity and walked back toward his waiting convoy. The residents watched him go, their paralysis born of disbelief and a dawning, sickening sense of self-awareness. Elias Keller, ever the loyal professional, held the door of the lead Escalade open for him. Julian slipped into the plush, cream-colored leather seat, the simple blue postal uniform looking utterly, surreally incongruous in the opulent interior. As the heavy door closed with a soft, expensive thud that sealed their fate, the spell that had held the crowd captive was broken. A cacophony of frantic, angry whispers erupted, quickly escalating into pointed accusations. All eyes, once filled with fawning adoration for Blythe Montgomery, now turned on her with a unified predatory fury. Her face was a ruin of her former arrogance, her mask of superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The champagne flute, forgotten in her hand, finally slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered on the stone patio, the sound unnaturally loud and violent in the tense atmosphere. The residents didn't look at her with sympathy. They looked at her with the cold, unforgiving calculation of people who had just been publicly humiliated and financially spurned. She hadn't just been arrogant. Her specific targeted arrogance had cost them $10 million. She was no longer their queen but the architect of their disgrace, the sole contemptible author of their very public, very expensive failure. The convoy of black Escalades pulled away from the curb with a powerful, silent grace, gliding past the clubhouse and disappearing down the winding road. They left behind a scene of utter social and emotional devastation, a lavish party that had instantly, irrevocably, become a wake. The stunned residents of Sapphire Glen stood frozen amidst their uneaten canapes and wilting floral arrangements, grappling with a harsh, undeniable truth. They had been weighed, they had been measured, and in the eyes of a man who truly understood the meaning of value, they had been found profoundly, irrevocably wanting. The sun still shone brightly on their perfect lawns, but for the first time, it felt less like a blessing and more like a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, exposing the ugly, rotten truth that lay just beneath the glittering, beautiful facade.